I'm really excited to be part of this. And Mary, Mary and I have known each other for a long time, and of course I'm a huge fan. So it's especially delightful to have this conversation with you and to talk about starting and ending books, because it seemed kind of appropriate, since you and I have actually both finished books, and I myself am starting a new book. So I'm kind of at both ends of the spectrum, and thought it would be a kind of great conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about, because you just recently embarked on another book project, and I'm curious, because I'm going through that right now, and I'm sort of weighing different possible books and thinking on a daily basis, yes, no, yeah, no. So how do you know when you've found a topic that is going to work as a book? That's bookable.
Well, I think it's really natural, even with a story, a magazine piece, let alone a book, that I have that exact same experience of, yay, best idea ever, stupid, horrible idea. What was I thinking? And I think that's natural if you tend to pick subjects that are not obvious, that are, subjects that are a little bit less than right on the nose, down the middle. How do you know, though, when that cycle of, particularly the moment of doubt, should you pay attention to that, or does it mean that the idea is really not worthy, or is that just the process you go through? The way I put things to the test only if they just keep nagging me. I think, great idea, no, not such a good idea. And then a day or two later, I think, that it really is kind of a good idea. And then I think, no. And it just persists. It persists, and it eventually overrides my natural doubt, which is, I think, typical, and frankly, most of the ideas that I have, both magazine and book ideas, very sane people might have said, this is not a good idea. So it has to really push me forward, is some persistent feeling that but I really am in, I kind of need to do it. And then once I'm in, I'm in.
Right. And I think we've all had the experience, especially with a first book, and when you're talking to agents, it's so easy for someone, not just an agent, but for someone to say, well, that sounds like a magazine piece, but not really a book. But I maintain that you could take any popular nonfiction book and you could almost make the argument, oh, that should be a magazine piece, not a book. So it's really up to you to just be brave and dive in and say, actually, this is going to be a book. It's not just going to be a magazine. This is going to be a book.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all had that experience as a reader, where a book is sort of wonderful and then it just fizzles, and it feels like there wasn't enough there. But I think that usually the problem is that the writer didn't push beyond the initial parameter of what the story was about, and go further, and not necessarily longer, but deeper. And that's always where I think stories fall apart, is you tell the story and you've kind of told the entire story, and what exists there still to do is to see how it resonates and grows more in a deep way than in a long way.
Right. I think, another thing I tell writers sometimes is that it's almost impossible to find a topic that isn't interesting if you dig deep enough. But it's just, people have to have faith when they buy your book, like, oh, this sounds like a dull topic, but I'm going to take that leap, or not dull, but this doesn't sound like a book, but I love this writer, so I'm going to take a leap. And you're one of those writers who I feel transcends topic. Like you could decide, I'm going to write a book about carafes, or tire rotation, and I'd be right there with you.
How did you know? My next book is about tire rotation. That's crazy, Mary. How did you know? No, first of all, I consider that the ultimate compliment. And I feel like the thing that I aspire to and that I really encourage people to think about is the storytelling rather than the subject. A great storyteller can engage you in just about anything. I mean, every subject is both totally finite and puny and gigantic. And the difference is how much the storyteller truly believes in the engagement that the subject can provide and the feeling that there's a journey to go on and that there's something marvelous to learn. And if you believe that as a writer, then the specifics aren't important. What's important is saying, my God, this is so exciting and interesting. I can't wait to tell you about it. And I don't even expect that initially you're going to think it's interesting. That's not the point. My job is to pick moments in life or in the world and hold them up to you and say, look how amazing and interesting this is. And that only happens because, for better or worse, that really is how I feel about the things I learn, that they are amazing and fascinating.
And one of the first pieces of yours that I read in the New Yorker, I think the moment I fell in love with you as a writer and a reporter it was about a piece about a neighborhood supermarket. I don't know if it was Brooklyn or the Bronx, but it was just an ordinary supermarket. And it was so interesting in the way that the people who worked there were rendered, and just the day-to-day, and just the mundaneness, there's probably a better noun that I'm missing, but the fact that it's something right under our noses all the time, there's a kind of exoticness, the fact that no one's ever written about it. Like, of course there are stories there, of course it's interesting, but to be able to see that that's an interesting subject to explore is not obvious to a lot of people.
And I think sometimes the most ordinary things to me become fascinating because I stop and think, wow, how do grocery stores work? I've never thought about it before, and I'm in grocery stores constantly, and the hiding in plain sight, that's one whole genre of ideas that excite me. The thing that's just sitting right in front of me that I've walked past a million times, and I stop and think, wow, I've never really thought about this. And then there's the other story, and I think that's very much what you do with your work, which is what could be more seemingly ordinary than the way your body, and instead you think, wait, have you really thought about this? And then there's another version of stories, which is the world that is not in plain sight. It exists. It's a whole universe that you simply didn't ever have an opportunity to stumble into, and suddenly there it is. And that, to me, is also an incredibly exciting, amazing sort of journey to take as a writer.
Right. Yeah, and a little bit easier to sell to a publisher maybe on the first book.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine how frightened a publisher would be if you said, so you know how boring grocery stores are? I want to write a story about that. And I don't even criticize them for that. The fact is that that's a hard subject to sell compared to some rather exotic universe that you can say, wow, I'm going to write about the headhunters of New Guinea, and everybody instantly is going to say, wow, that's cool. That's something I'm not ever going to get to experience, and I hear it's really exotic, and that's sexy.
Yeah.
Grocery stores would not be sexy except if you fall in love with the telling of that story, that's where the sex appeal comes from, is from
Right.
the storyteller.
Right. And you have that wonderful story about you were called to do a profile of Macaulay Culkin for, I forget which, was it Vanity Fair?
Or
And
Esquire.
you, huh? Esquire. Esquire, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Esquire.
Right. Yeah. Well, why don't you tell that? Because I love that. It's just like, Macaulay Culkin to you was not particularly fascinating. You're like, why don't we just do an ordinary boy of that age and put him on the cover, which would make any other with a lot of other writers would make them kind of like, well, she wants to do a random kid, but it's just this wonderful profile.
Yeah, I mean, this was an instance where I'd been offered this assignment to profile Macaulay Culkin, who was then 10 years old. And I just thought, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I don't find the idea of writing about Macaulay Culkin terribly interesting. And I can't imagine his life. I mean, maybe his life is really interesting, but I knew as a writer I would never really see that life. So for reasons that still mystify me, I thought it was wise to suggest to the editor that we just take some random kid in a suburb and profile him. And to this day, I'm amazed that the editor said, yeah, okay, fine. And I mean, it was a pretty bold editorial move, because when you go to your ad people and say, okay, December issue, pretty exciting, kid in New Jersey, see if you can sell some ads around that. Not necessarily a very easy sell as opposed to a celebrity. And, I think sometimes being kind of naive, which I was at the time, about marketability is a good thing. I just thought, this is way more interesting. This is much, much, much more intriguing and real. And I will say, if I may add this in, it is vastly harder. And as you're writing that story about the ordinary 10-year-old boy, you just think, why didn't I profile Macaulay Culkin? It's so much easier. I mean, frankly, it is easier because you begin with the fact that people are interested in celebrities. We all are. And so you automatically, you don't have to explain to people why they should care about a profile of a celebrity. You can just assume that, of course, they're going to be interested. But ordinariness begs for the writer to argue to you why you ought to pay attention. And I both am vexed by the fact that I am attracted to stories like that, and I know that that's what interests me. And sometimes I find that challenge really just kind of thrilling. Like, I know it's not what you ever thought you'd want to read about, but I'm going to try really hard to explain to you why it's so interesting. And so there's this challenge that I can't seem to resist.
Right. Yeah. I think that as writers, we crave a little bit of challenge. Like for me to try, like with Stiff, it was kind of, because it was a little gruesome. I didn't want people to be put off, so it was I would take this information and these facts and these images in my head and try to think, like, what would be a way to present this where I don't repel people, like I pull them in some way. I mean, but so it was a writing challenge that appealed to me, to make the material not gross. I mean, people are expecting gross, and maybe it was a little gross, but yeah, that wasn't the intent. The intent was like, no, come with me. This is interesting. It's not just gross. It's really interesting, and that had to be done with the writing. Yeah.
Well, and I think something that I've been talking about a lot lately is the part of being a writer that is the closest parallel that I feel is that of being a teacher. And teachers sometimes have to, teachers need to sometimes, seduce you into learning about things that you might initially not wish to learn. So I think that for a writer,
Right.
that's very much the same experience and the same state of mind that you have to be in, which is, okay, you might find this gross or disturbing or boring, or, a great teacher can say to you, okay, algebra, we're going to make it fun. And that isn't to, I think that's the challenge then. Not everything that ends up being worth learning about starts off seeming like it's going to be worth learning about, and that's where the teacher comes in and makes it. We've all had classes that you come out of thinking, God, I'm so excited about, classical Greek, and you later think, well, it was all
Yeah.
about the teacher. The teacher made it
Yeah.
exciting to learn.
Yeah.
Even if I don't find myself
Yeah.
using classical Greek very often, the experience of learning was exciting.
Yeah, for me it was a physics teacher. Physics, we're gonna take. I'll ask you one more question, and then we're gonna, I think, welcome people who are sitting in on the system to ask questions. But I wanted to ask you about, since we did sort of say that in the title of this, about how you have enough information to stop a book. How do you wind down and know that you've gathered enough information, that you've finished writing, that you're done, especially when it's a major, in the case of Rin Tin Tin, what, 7, 10, I don't know, how a long time.
Yeah, lots of years. I think that's a great question, because it, in a sense, there's never a point where you truly know everything about a subject. And sometimes, say, if you're working on a magazine piece, there's a very simple way to know. When your editor says, if you don't turn it in tomorrow, you're fired. So that is very helpful and very clarifying. But in the case of a book or a project where there isn't a deadline that is shaping your timetable, I think there's a very clear message to me that instructs me about when it's time to start writing. And I will say, I don't write at all while I'm reporting. I'm just reporting. In the beginning, when you're starting a new subject, every day you are learning just a huge amount of information, and everything you're learning is brand new. And you just feel like it's just more new, information. You're just this huge sponge, and you never are doubling back over anything you already learned. So it's this super steep learning curve. And then over time, the learning curve begins to flatten out. And my guess is you've had this experience as well, that not every day are you learning so much. You are hearing some of the same stuff over again, or, which I found really interesting, sometimes you begin knowing a little bit more than some of the people you're talking to, only because you are gathering the information from all these different sources. And that's the moment when the learning curve flattens out, that I know it's time for me to transition from being a student of my subject to being the teacher of the subject. And it absolutely is an intuitive thing. And also, that's when you begin feeling confident. And you think, well, wow, I know this subject. I know Rin Tin Tin's history. It's begun to kind of congeal into something that's very whole, and I can tell my story.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, should we, I think Tom's going to come back on and facilitate, or someone's going to
I'm sorry there, Mary. I didn't mean to cut you off. But yes, let's take some questions from the audience. And just to remind everyone, the way you do that is either click the raise hand button if you'd like to ask your question via video, or click the ask a question to submit it via text. So we're going to start off with a question here from Catherine from Oklahoma. Wants to know, do you tend to start with the beginning or the end of a story?
I always start with the beginning. And I think I think sometimes you'll come across information that, in fact, I have something hanging right here on the wall of my office that I had come across years early on in my reporting about Rin Tin Tin, and I knew it was going to be a paragraph. But more often than not, that doesn't happen. And I feel that I have to tell a story from the beginning straight through, sort of chronologically, much the way I would if I were doing it orally and just telling people, I've spent 8 years learning about Rin Tin Tin. You know, here's where the story begins, and that leads me to the end. Mary, do you do that as well? Do you start and work your way through to the end, or do you write in chunks?
No, as soon as I have material for a chapter and it feels like this is what I'm going to work with, as quickly as I can, I write it so that I break that horrible tension of the huge pile of research material and the non-existent pile of written material. When those are out of balance, I get this kind of anxiety. So I will write it even though I don't necessarily know where it's going to fit in. But my books are very different. I'm not telling a story, you know, with a chronological arc the way you are. So.
Right, right. And I do think that's really different. When my first book, Saturday Night, was very episodic, and I actually did write some of those sections before I sat down and had finished the entire reporting. And that was very different. And then I went back and kind of revised everything now that I knew what I had. In the case of Rin Tin Tin, you know, I reported for years and I didn't have one sentence written. And it is stressful. But I also didn't feel that I knew the story yet. And I felt like I had to finish learning before I even had the slightest idea of where to begin and where to end.
It's hard to pace. The pacing is tough to know. How much time do you spend on this chunk if you don't know what the whole project encompasses? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's just put it simply. Writing a book is hell, but you knew that.
What's that quote? Who's that who said, writing a book is a horrible, exhaustive struggle like some long bout with a painful illness? I think that was, who was that? Oh, I can't think of
Oh my God.
It escapes me. Yeah.
Well, that's why the idea, I mean, every time I've done it, I've just said, that's it. No more books. I'm done. I'm just done.
Yeah.
And then, and I will actually say to friends don't let friends write books. You know, just stop me. Don't let me do this again. And when and then I stumbled across this idea that I got very excited about, and I kept thinking, no, don't bring it near me. And I had a few friends say to me, do you want me to talk you out of this? Because remember, you told me that you would be talked out of it. And I'd say, no, I mean, this is different because this one I actually want to do. And they all nodded, like, sad. It's sad. She's lost to us. Yeah.
Do we have more questions coming in?
I think we're going to get Tom here with some more.
Yes, we do. And so we have some great questions coming in. And the next one is from Holly. And Holly wants to know, the subject of her question is structure of writing in Rin Tin Tin. Rin Tin Tin is a beautiful blend of first person and third person. When is it appropriate? When is it not appropriate?
That's a really a gigantic question, and one, I can answer this very simply, because it actually goes back to the story about the grocery store that I had reported for the New Yorker. I had spent about 6 weeks at this grocery store trying to just learn how this place worked. To me, it was like a little universe and fascinating. I began writing it with a third person, not detached, but length tone. There were certain parts of the story that I simply couldn't tell without acknowledging that I was the person either experiencing it or wondering about it. There was just no way to do it. And it reminded me of the times when you'll read a story in the New York Times and it'll say, Joe Blow told a reporter. And you know that the reporter is the person writing the story. So that's a newspaper. They've got conventions that don't allow for a more personal voice. And in the case of writing that grocery store story, suddenly I thought, I can solve this. I can solve it not by making myself the subject of the story, but by acknowledging my participation in it. And I can step in and be in it and step out and go on with the story. It's one of the more challenging parts of writing the way that I do, but I feel like there's to go back to the oral tradition, if I were telling someone the story of Rin Tin Tin, I would tell some of the historical stuff very much in the third person, and then I might naturally segue into saying, I was so interested in this because when I was a kid, I was obsessed with this Rin Tin Tin figurine, and it came from my grandfather. My grandfather, and then moved back into a third person voice. So I just repeatedly go back to the model of how would you tell this story out loud? Those rules, which are mostly, excuse me, a matter of tone, that you just feel that it's right or not right. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. What bad timing. Those are the rules that I feel it sounds right to the ear when you move back and forth.
There's a question from Joanne. Do you often look for ideas to write about, or do they just strike you?
But, I mean, I'm so sorry. How annoying. This is me broadcasting.
You want to sip?
You got the water. Can we get
Can I
virtual
pour it
water?
on your...
Pour it through the internet. Sometimes an idea will simply, I'm just bumbling along in my normal everyday life, and something will just strike me as really funny or odd, and I say, my God, that's a great story. And it's a habit of mine that I think I'm just in. That's the way I look at life, is something funny or interesting will sort of lodge in my head as a story. But there are also times when you think, and this I would say happens to me pretty much every single time I finish any story I've ever written or any book, I immediately think there are no more stories in the world. That's it. I've now exhausted the entire, cache of story ideas, and I will never again come up with an idea. And when I was working on a sort of schedule where I promised a certain number of stories a year, when I felt that kind of panic and think, where do you find ideas? And I would just often go for a walk. I was living in Manhattan at the time, and I would just walk and think, if I can't come across a story idea in Manhattan, I'm hopeless. Right. It's all over.
Right. Yeah.
Or I'd go go to this crazy newsstand that had newspapers and magazines from everywhere and anywhere and just think I'm gonna find some little story. And even if I didn't find a story there, it got me in the state of mind where I thought, all right, all is not lost. There are stories out there.
We have Jake asking, how do you approach aspects of a story that are very complex or difficult to explain?
That happens a lot, and that's not to sort of beat the same dead horse, but I feel like the best way for me with something that is complicated is to talk it out loud and try to explain it to someone in real time, and usually my poor husband ends up being that person. And, preferably he doesn't know anything about the subject, so I need to explain it. Somebody asked me recently, how much pre-knowledge should you assume on the part of your reader? And that's of course, part of what makes this complicated. You're not sure how much you need to explain, but, I think feeling, number one, that you really know this complicated thing is the single most important aspect of it. That you actually truly know it, and you can explain it to someone without notes out loud. Listen to how you're explaining it, and similarly listen to their questions, because that will give you a clue to what you're not explaining well.
Yeah, and I think if you don't understand it well, the tone of the writing suffers, because you're almost just sort of lifting some explanation and sticking it in there, and it doesn't sound like you anymore because you haven't really internalized it, I find.
Right, and I agree completely. That's why I think when you're telling it out loud, you shouldn't be telling it from notes. You've got, right. Because that's a good way to see, do I really understand this? Do I, and then can I therefore write it with the necessary confidence that comes from knowing the material? And it really is, everything begins there, I think.
Yeah. The next question, I think we covered, do you do the majority of your research first, or do you research as you go so it stays fresh? And I know, Tin, you did all the research first. But,
I actually always do that. You run the risk when you sit down to write that you've lost some of that freshness. But the trade-off is, I feel like I can't really write with that confidence until I know the whole story. And I feel that I know what it is that I'm trying to tell.
Right. Carol has a question. How do you know when a subject that interests you can actually work as a nonfiction book? And that's, I suppose, work for yourself and also work for a publisher, which are two kind of different things.
Yeah. I just, if I'm excited and in love with the idea, I just go with my own enthusiasm, because, and sometimes I'll love an idea and just know in very practical terms that the audience might be extremely limited. But mostly, if I am really excited, I think I'm going to make it interesting. I'm going to make it work for people. And as for a publisher, that's a different matter, because they sit there and think, who can we count on as an audience? If it's an incredibly obscure subject, they're going to be worried about it. And then all you can do is just say, I'm in love with this idea. So really what you're marketing is my enthusiasm.
That's right, yeah. Now we have, do you try to create a shape or structure for the book before you start writing? If not, questions? If not, can you describe the way that you shape the book as you go?
I definitely try to create a almost visual structure, not not, I mean, some people like John McPhee will talk about how this book was a spiral and this one was shaped like a lobster. And, I'm not quite that. Well, first of all, I'm not John McPhee, and I also don't have quite that elaborate of a visual image of this idea. But I definitely, when I write a book, I take all of my notes and at some point transfer them or some sort of synopsis of each unit of information and put it on an index card. And then I lay all of those index cards out. In the case of Rin Tin Tin, I had 800. And as I spread them out and review them and think about them, they begin taking shape, even if it's just that they consolidate into groups that make sense. And I see how I would go from group A, this is about World War I, and this is a whole group of ideas about pop culture, and they form units of thought, and I see how it'll shape up. And then, of course, things change as you're writing, but I feel very strongly that I need to have that structure. I guess it's the equivalent of an outline, but I don't do it as an outline because I've never been able to remember how you do an outline.
I wanted to encourage people, we've got time for a couple more questions. I wanted to encourage people to actually come up on video and have a dialogue. I think the way that you do that is to click raise hand if you want to ask a question that way. So I encourage people to not be shy and come up here in the spotlight and have a chit chat with the fabulous Susan Orlean. So if anybody wants to do that.
And the extra fabulous Mary Roach. Oh, cool. So we have someone who popped up. Hi.
Hi. Can you hear me? I don't know if it's working.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, and I think in the audience can hear you.
Okay, I wasn't sure my microphone was working. My question is, when you have those 800 index cards spread out, then how do you deal with them? How do you organize them? I have a problem like that with, I have a problem with that with the book I'm writing, and so how do you go about that? When you have so much material and you do have those index cards and they're all spread out, how do you do it?
Oh, well, first of all, I have all the cards numbered, and then the material they refer to is also, I correlate them with the material they refer to. I mean, one of the issues with writing a book is just this physical mass of stuff. And no matter how, and I actually feel that it would be very hard for me to write a book with everything being digitized and on my computer. I actually need the physical sort of notes. And then also, if you're using any material that's not off a computer, clippings, documents, those aren't going to be digital. But with those massive index cards, I organized them in what I thought was the flow of the book. And then I hung them, as I'd work on a section, I would paste them up on my wall so that I could follow where I was going with the chapter. And then as I used them, I would mark them used and put them aside so that I could, and I would bring up the box of material that they referred to and had that on hand. But I do think you need to break it down in some way that you don't get just overwhelmed by stuff and start getting lost. I use Evernote, and as I said, I don't think everything can be digitized, but Evernote, if you're familiar with it, is a a it's a system that can record and organize information that's either text, web clippings, voice memos, photographs, pretty much anything. And it can be tagged and organized. And I started using that on Rin Tin Tin, and I found it helpful, but I still feel that any project, there's going to be a lot of material that's not going to be on your computer, and you have to not get lost and not lose the stuff that you're trying to reference, and you have to come up with a system. I mean, mine's very crude, but it kind of works for me, numbering things and then having a card that refers to that material.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for joining us. By the way, thanks to all of you for being here, and thank you, Tom, and all the folks at Shindig, and Jen from Booktalk Nation, because this is pretty great. I mean, my God, the modern world.
I know, this worked. How about
Mary's
that?
in San Francisco. Isn't that amazing? Mary's in San Francisco. I'm in the wilds of Dutchess County, New York, and you guys are from God knows where. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's really great. Do we? Although, look, I think there's one more. There's one more question I'll ask, and unless somebody else raises their hand, the question is: are there certain ways of signaling to the reader when you are elaborating or conjecturing on something in a particular scene? Certain ways of signaling to the reader.
You mean if I'm understanding the question, in other words, if you are speculating rather than writing specifically off factual reporting. And I believe I think maybe that's the question. I believe
so.
I think in a funny way that's extremely easy, which is the readers are very, very generous in accepting limitations. They know a writer is human. They know our ability to know things is finite. I am extremely hardcore about never speculating or, conflating without letting people know. And I think that a reader doesn't mind if you say, Lee Duncan was on a battlefield, must have been very lonely. I imagine he was lonely. He's an 18-year-old kid in the middle of the war. To me, that's absolutely honest, and it doesn't slow the reader down. I think if anything, you form almost more of a bond with readers if you acknowledge, first of all, your limit as a storyteller, and the fact that, of course, we all speculate, and that's just human, but I would never put that forward as if this were fact. I just where I would say
the omniscient narrator.
Yeah, Lee, it's 1918, Lee is sad and lonely, and I think, oh, and how did I manage to time travel to 1918?
Exactly.
Whereas I think a reader is very comfortable if you say, he was a kid alone, away from home for the first time in the middle of the war. I imagine he was desperately lonely.
Yeah. We have Claire Meeker, who is a popular children's author who wants to do the video thing, so I will disappear, right?
Oh, that was my question. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Hi, Claire.
Hi.
Hi.
That was my question, the one that you just answered so beautifully. Can you hear? Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
About speculating and how to handle, for the purposes of a scene, that's a, you know, an important scene where you're trying to express an emotion, but you really don't know that you don't know exactly factually that may be correct. So you're conjecturing.
Well, and I think the thing, I don't think it's necessary then in each subsequent sentence to keep saying, I imagine this, I think this, I'm speculating that. But I think that you respect the reader and you make them comfortable by saying, I imagine he was lonely. He hadn't seen his mother in a year. The war was frightening. You've said to people, I'm thinking out loud now. I'm imagining out loud what it would be like to be this kid. And, you know, if you, again, not to go back once more, but I will, if you were telling a story out loud and say, I'm learning about Rin Tin Tin, a fascinating story. You know, he was owned by this young man. He was a kid grown up on a ranch in California, had never been anywhere in his life, and suddenly he was in the middle of the war. It must have been awful. I can't imagine what it would have been like. That's the way you would say it for real. Telling people, you wouldn't say, Lee woke up, he was sad. You would never do that. That's not the way we talk. And you would never believe me if I said that to you, because you would again have that feeling of, well, how would you know that? You know, I can believe you when you say, I've learned a lot about this guy, and I know what that moment in history was like because I've learned a lot about that. I can imagine it was a desperate time, and for him to find a puppy in the middle of this desperate moment must have been exhilarating. I don't think that sounds awkward or I think that actually sounds just honest. And I really believe that readers can hear you acknowledging your limits, and then and at the same time you're the teacher, right? So you're able to then say, I can imagine it must have been like such and so. I feel like it's a really important thing. And certainly as a reader, I cannot read something that's pretending omniscience without just feeling immediately that this is phony. And it's dishonest. I don't believe it.
Okay, thank you so much. This is
Sure. I hope that's.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay,
Hello,
I
Mary
think
Roach.
I guess. Hello. I guess we're winding it up now. So I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us, and thank Shindig and Booktalk Nation and Tom for helping us with all the tricky technical stuff, and Susan, of course, for being here. Yay! I'm clapping.
And, you know, I would also like to thank Oblong Books, my local bookstore here in Rhinebeck, New York. And I believe they are going to be the providers of any books that you guys are ordering. And I think, I probably shouldn't say this, but I think, can't they be, aren't they will be signed?
There are, yes, Oblong Books and...
Rather than saying they will be signed, I will sign them.
Yeah, that's right. And Book Passage in San Francisco is also will be sending out signed by me that I have signed copies of Gulp. So those are, yeah, those books are available. And then it's through Booktalk Nation. The two independent bookstores are working with Booktalk Nation, I believe. So that's also going on.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I so appreciate everybody joining us. It's great. And this is my very first crazy high-tech experience like this, so I expect to have more in the future.
Yes, and this is Jen from Booktalk Nation. We want to say a big thank you to everyone who joined us tonight for this discussion with these wonderfully talented women. And as they said, yes, you can order those books from booktalknation.com, and then their local independent stores will fulfill the orders, and Mary and Susan will be signing them. I believe Mary has Gulp, and Susan has Ren 1010, and several other titles. So you can do that at booktalknation.com, and the sales will close tomorrow night at midnight. And then those local independents will ship them right to your door. And thank you, Susan, of course, and Mary, and Shindig for setting this all up tonight. Thank you, everyone.
All right, great. Thanks. Good night.